Welcome to our Voices of Africa podcast, brought to you by Africa Practice, a strategic advisory firm supplying insights and advocacy solutions to corporations, investors, governments, and foundations in Africa. In a world with complex and interdependent challenges, we take the guesswork out of business engagement. We enable our clients to see more clearly in order to drive sustainable and equitable development.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Voices of Africa. I'm your host, Daniel Turler, and on this podcast series, we talk to the change makers driving the future of the African continent. I'm joined today by my co-host, Laura Nicholson, the Head of Product Development at Investing in African Mining Indaba. Over the last few weeks, we've been speaking to leaders in the mining sector ahead of the Mining Indaba 2026, one of the most important events in the mining calendar. Laura, it's great to have you with us today and great to have another key mining leader in the studio with us.
Hi Daniel, it's great to be hosting with you. We are excited to bring a special series of conversations with mining leaders as part of the partnership between Africa Practice and Mining Indaba, focusing on disruptors, on advocates and champions of the African mining industry, an industry that is now more than ever at the heart of the global energy transition.
It's such an interesting time to be working in the sector, Laura, and I think particularly in the South African context where you and I and our guest who's joining us today have seen successive cycles in terms of what this industry can go through. And I think our guest today is going to have a lot to say about that progress and the challenges we still face as a mining industry in South Africa. So we're joined today by Mzila Mthenjane, the CEO of the Minerals Council of South Africa. Mzila, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Daniel, for having me on the show. It's my second podcast in my short lifetime that I've done, and I think I agreed to do this one because the first one actually was quite pleasant. And so just not to put you under pressure. And Laura, thank you very much for considering me for this interview. Quite long-term planning ahead of Mining Indaba 2026. And having seen the program recently, it's actually something to look forward to. So we've also begun preparing for that event next year.
And may this podcast just be a small prequel of excitement that we'll have when we convene together next year in February. So thank you so much. I think we've got a good conversation ahead of us. I hope it's as pleasant as your first one. The South African mining sector is navigating a period of unprecedented change. The global demand for critical minerals, as we know, the imperative for achieving greener metals production. Mzila, your leadership at the Minerals Council is vital in guiding this industry through these complexities. And I'm quite keen to get your view. So I think a good starting point is just reminding our audience of the long career that you've had in the mining industry, one that I didn't even realize myself, but I know that extends to Anglo Gold Ashanti, it extends to Goldfields, it extends to, I think, Royal Bafokeng and definitely Exxaro.
Yeah.
Even, Mzila, I believe you were in the investment banking sector. So what are some of the learnings that you have experienced across your career that is now informing your role of leadership at the Minerals Council?
No, thank you very much. And perhaps it is a good starting point to talk about me specifically. And because I think one of the things I've discovered about this role is that you cannot be in the role of CEO during the day and be something else at the end of the day. It's all one. And so there are a lot of personal attributes that one brings into the role. And I think over the course of my career, having started with, graduating out of Wits, I don't know where the bug for mining bit me. But even when I left investment banking, I knew that I was going to get back into mining. And we can talk about why I got into investment banking. But one of the important things about mining is just the importance of emphasizing on practicality. And that eventually, crystallized when I actually worked at Rand Merchant Bank with Paul Harris, who used to say, the business case must prevail. And that's always important when you are in a commercial entity, that the solutions you come up with have to be practical, and you have to make sure that the sustainability of the business is preserved. So that's one thing that I've kept in my mind, and whenever one takes a decision, reflected against that statement of, have you still got the business case for the decision that you're taking? And then the other important thing that I learned was, this whole concept of sustainability, and have seen it evolve. When I was in the mining operations, we didn't really talk about sustainability. The concept was remote at best. But then I think it was when I then started working in investment banking and later on in mining that I really got to appreciate what sustainability is. And I often say the school of sustainability for me was when I worked for the Royal Bafokeng Nation. That was a huge privilege and an honor for me, because it is one area where I saw capital partnering with community. And the most important thing was actually the pivoting that the Royal Bafokeng themselves had to make in order to be able to be a preferred partner with capital, but I think also to be able to leverage capital for the benefit of community. And so with the help of many other legal and technical mining companies, they were able to structure their mining portfolio and other investment opportunities separate but still related to the community in terms of how the benefit will flow, over time. And that was a very important lesson for me, and I think that helped in terms of my future roles when it came to the stakeholder management role that I had at Exxaro. And then the other aspect was post 1994, every black male and female got onto the train of renaming themselves from their English words to the African name. So my full name is Mzila Mthenjane, and when I was working with Rand Merchant Bank, I found myself just contemplating on the issue of why I was named Mzila, because in my ID, that's my first name, but I used Isaac pretty much most of my life up until Rand Merchant Bank. And in interrogating that, firstly, your Mzila means a path in Nguni languages, and I was named after a brother to my grandfather, and I'm the firstborn of Jimmy and Bertha Mthenjane, who still live. And so when I was looking at a lot of other African names, I realized that there's a lot of delegation that is, I think, either implied or intended in a lot of African names. And I then began to think of what it means from a leadership perspective. And it's actually an exercise that I used when I took up the role at Exxaro, where I asked everyone to give me their meaning of their names. And out of that, you then look at what does this mean in terms of team structure and team building? Because if you have somebody who has a name that speaks to compassion, it speaks to their character, and they're likely to bring that into their role in the workplace. And so you put different names together, I think you can actually end up with a very interesting team dynamics and team composition that can play to your strength as a leader, but also in a company. And I'm sure that would apply to many other cultures as well. And so those are the few things that I think I always refer to in my role, just to keep me centered. And I think lastly, leading with humility. I have this one of three key attributes, I believe, for leadership. It's just a high degree of selflessness. That in what I do, I don't do it for myself or for my benefit. And so always have an outward perspective to the role in terms of why am I doing this? How am I going to benefit from it? Because it's a role that comes with a significant amount of responsibility and accountability. And one always has to have that top of mind that, the decision that I take is going to affect so many other people.
Mzila, thank you. That was a fascinating reflection on leadership and your career and your learnings through the industry. I think a lot of us are drawn to mining early on, and it's quite hard to leave, because once we start understanding the culture, once we start understanding the people, and once we start understanding its centrality to our country and its success, it's quite difficult to work in other places and other sectors.
Yeah.
And it's just it's a very distinctive culture, it's a very distinctive industry, and it's a very important industry. So thank you for those reflections. One of the other things that really struck me were your comments on sustainability. And I think that term really gets thrown around to excess sometimes in the mining industry. But I think one of the things I'm the most encouraged about in the last few years in the South African context is just how much progress we've made in terms of really ingraining sustainable practice, and then starting to make real massive investments into things like renewables. So I think in terms of where our conversation goes next, I'm really keen to explore how the council's work and how your work is supporting that change. And it is hugely significant. We have 16,000 megawatts of power coming on from renewable sources. So we've transformed our power sector, and we're doing it at pace.
No, absolutely. And maybe let's pick up on the topic of sustainability, because you're right that it's an expression that tends to be thrown around quite a bit. Sustainable environment, sustainable community, sustainable business. And I'm trying to move away from it and rather focus or come up with a new expression of, which for me seems to carry a little bit more meaning, which is enduring, But I think an important thing to appreciate with sustainability is that it's got a number of dimensions to it. There's a time dimension, which one must appreciate. And I think that comes through in the Brundtland report in terms of what sustainable development is, doing today with due consideration for the future. But there's another important element, which is one of change. That sustainability doesn't mean that you're going to stay the same over time. Over the period of time, there's going to be lots of volatility, there's going to be lots of change, and you need to be able to manage that change. And so, change management and the capabilities around that are absolutely critical to achieving that sustainability. And then another important one is how you then are able to balance competing interests amongst different stakeholders. Because, you're unlikely to be sustainable if you pursue the interests of one at the expense of the other. And so one's got to be able to consider the balancing act that is required across time, across different key stakeholders, and across different issues. And so when it comes to the mining industry, South Africa's mining industry has been operating for more than 100 years and has been going strong until the recent 20 years, 15 to 20 years, and particularly given, I think, two major issues. I think the first one is around the impact of the way in which policy changes have taken place, particularly related to mining. I mean, you remember when the Mining Charter 2002 was released, there was, I think, a $50 to $100 billion loss in the stock market in a space of 2 to 3 days. And there are questions that are asked as to whether we have recovered from that. And it's a bit difficult to attribute what we've seen or perceived, and I'll explain that word, perceived decline of the mining industry over the past couple of years. And then there's the second element, which is more recent in terms of just the impact of infrastructure such as electricity and logistics. And you overlay that with the crime and corruption, which has resulted in an almost near fatal performance of these sectors. And then when you look at then the structure of the mining industry, firstly in terms of precious metals, on the one hand the gold, platinum group metals and diamonds, and on the other being the bulk commodities, being your coal, iron ore, manganese, chrome. They are very dependent distinctively on electricity in terms of precious metals, and then on the bulk commodities in terms of exports and route to market in as far as your logistics on rail and port. And obviously underlying that is just electricity for business in general. And I think this will allow us to come back to the conversation on, on Operation Vulindlela. But I think, coming back to your question, the investment in renewables. First and foremost, given the challenges that we're experiencing with electricity, that was an opportunity, and especially if you look at the reforms that drove a significant amount of investments that came through, where for investing in and installing 100 megawatts, you didn't need the kind of approvals that are required, and that unlocked that industry. And the industry had to invest because first it had to respond to the risk of potential energy shortage. Secondly, the fact that it was actually investing in renewables meant that that investment would also bring to bear the benefits of reduction of coal-based electricity from Eskom. And that means that the journey then to low carbon emissions business was beginning for the industry. And then the third and key element was that we could foresee from then on that the price of electricity from Eskom was going to escalate. It had already been escalating at significant rates. And so there was also the added benefit of cost reduction and getting mining sector into a competitive position when it comes to electricity cost. And so the 16 gigawatts that we've seen at almost 275 billion rands had been installed and still planned, was in the first instance an imperative to ensure that mining continues to operate, that particularly on the gold mines and the underground mines, broadly speaking, you needed to have that surety of electricity supply such that should there anything happen whilst people are working underground, you've got enough electricity to be able to hoist people, you're able to continue to provide ventilation, and that way you're actually ensuring the continued safety of mines should there be a problem with electricity supply.
Mzila, while you were talking, and I appreciate your views on sustainability, I'm quite aligned with them, so much so that when you talk about sustainability at Mining Indaba, it's not even its own program anymore. It's just integrated into all of our conversations because it's become BAU. It's not this singled out kind of topic that we need to be talking about in isolation. So I think your views around sustainability are really interesting, and I think it does kind of lead me to where I want to take the conversation next. And you mentioning precious metals and you mentioning export metals, and I just realized that your experience really does span the full metals range, so to speak. And when we talk about critical minerals in particular, and there's a lot of interesting conversation at the moment about what really constitutes a critical mineral. So let's acknowledge that as a starting point. I think, from our perspective, it's critical if your country or your continent needs it. Nonetheless, regardless of what anyone says is a critical mineral, there's this attachment that comes with it now in terms of future supply, right? And that is the concept of low carbon sourcing. Now, I've written this terminology down because I know I'm going to forget it, right? The EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, right, is essentially challenging exporters to prove their green credentials. Now, when it comes to South Africa in particular, I'm wondering, are we ready? What do we need to do from a technological point of view, a structural point of view, to ensure that the South African mining industry is ensuring compliance when it comes to these kinds of standards, regardless of what mineral we're really talking about? Because I think we're challenging the notion of where critical minerals is going. So just low carbon sourcing in general, and how do we make sure that that's still important in the conversation?
Yeah, and we spent and we continue to spend a lot of time engaging on the topic of critical minerals. And we played a role with the DMPR in terms of developing the critical mineral strategy for South Africa. And it taught us a lot about the thinking that influenced the definition of critical minerals from a number of jurisdictions. But it also helped us in terms of defining critical minerals from what we call a supplier perspective. Given that there's this division between global north and global south, where global north are the ones who are quite advanced in terms of defining that expression and what it is from them. And it's all about securing minerals in order to be able to fulfill their long-term economic and technology development strategies. And so they've defined within that what they will need. And obviously being territories where mining is no longer as extensive as compared to the global south, supply chain risk becomes the important issue to consider. And then within that, and this is where I think there's going to be a very interesting dynamic, that you can't, as Europe, put up CBAM and the rules of and terms of engagement in terms of low carbon inputs when you're the one who actually needs these minerals. And you also need to be considerate, fair, and equitable in terms of the existing conditions under which these minerals are produced. Related to that, I think there's an important thinking that I have been developing in terms of South Africa and critical minerals. So we've put out a critical minerals strategy, or at least that's what we call it, which categorizes into three elements, three areas around high criticality, medium to low, and then low. And then the high criticality are the precious metals, platinum particularly, iron ore, manganese, chrome, and no surprise, coal. And why these? Because they're the metals that earn South Africa the largest amount of tax revenue, of foreign currency, employment, and from a substitutability perspective, I think South Africa has the largest reserves in the world amongst those. And in terms of their end use, they are the metals which have the least likelihood of being substituted. However, the way that the strategy has been defined has been from a perspective of how we are benefiting as a country. And I think it's been overlain with the fact that we do need to have beneficiation in order to kind of extend and uplift the value of those minerals for us to supply. My view is that it's a strategy which is still looking at supply with some value add. I would like to see us actually use the same methodology as the Global North to provide another definition of critical minerals to complement this existing definition, which is to say, if we are to develop an infrastructure-driven economic plan, what are the mineral materials we would need for that? Because we're actually in a position where we do need significant amount of infrastructure. Firstly, fixing what we have, the amount of electricity we need for generation, the amount of transmission we will need, and distribution. So that speaks to iron ore, that speaks to manganese, the metals and alloys to make iron ore for steel, and I guess maybe aluminium. It speaks to copper with the electrification that's going to be required. And if we're specific about my favorite example, we want every city in South Africa to be linked to Johannesburg, so by train, both people and cargo. How much steel is that going to require? And do we have enough iron ore, particularly, to be and we've got at least some capacity for producing iron ore. So ArcelorMittal would be in dreamland at this moment, I guess. But do we have enough iron ore from Kumba, from Assmang, to be able to provide that? And this is where I think there's an opportunity then in terms of Africa and its own definition of critical minerals from its own development, economic development perspective. We can begin to establish regional linkages that actually first and foremost benefit the continent from these critical minerals based on our definition first, but also, and our needs, but also what the rest of the world needs. And this is where I see, for instance, we've got one of the biggest iron ore mines being developed on the continent in Guinea, Simandou. The transport of that to South Africa in order for beneficiating, and then the end use of that is also in Africa, is an opportunity in my mind. I think it will need a little bit more research, but I think in this context of critical minerals, I think that's how we need to think about it, how we fulfill our needs first. And it comes back to the question of, well, what about Europe and CBAM? Well, I think for me, this is a strategy that needs to look at what Africa needs first. And the other regional opportunity that could perhaps also assist in as far as for those minerals that need to be supplied to countries like Europe, which need to be of a low carbon nature. There's also the regional opportunity of a networked electricity generation, which consists of a bit of Eskom in terms of coal, hydro from Central Africa, DRC, renewables in terms of the rest of the continent. And I think that way we can begin to see a pathway to clean energy, but starting off perhaps with a dominant coal base in an energy mix with other renewable energy sources. And over time, as we increase our investment in renewables, you dilute the coal. And I think the advantage of that is that you're beginning to invest in the necessary manufacturing to get you on that development path, firstly. And secondly, you are manufacturing to get you to a point where the products that the energy metals that you're producing, you're able to get them into an end-use form using low-carbon energy. And this is something that I think needs to be a 10, 20, 30-year strategy. That is the outlook in terms of the development of the continent and the kind of investments that will be required.
Mzila, it's fascinating to hear your thoughts in terms of regional integration in Africa, particularly as we're heading into one of the most high-profile weeks in SA's history as we go into G20. And I think that regional integration agenda is going to be part of the conversation. And my sincere hope is that that's one of the key things that we start to advance, is starting to think about our own needs and our own requirements and moving away from that very export-driven mentality in terms of our traditional trade partners. There's a huge realignment in trade. We've seen, the old multilateral order is broken down almost irrevocably, I think. And we've got to start thinking about how African nations and South Africa as a leader in that repositioning start to redefine their roles and their importance. The critical piece there to me is how we entrench and restore our infrastructure advantage. That's one important component. I think the other critical component is how we reimagine partnerships and how we identify who our allies and our supporters can be internationally. And maybe one of the examples we can draw on in terms of partnership and the power of collaboration is the work we've done through Operation Vulindlela, which I think is a real model for driving real change, for bringing parties together and doing country duty, for want of a better term. So I'd really like to hear, we touched on it a little earlier. There was a really interesting piece from Eddie Enthoven earlier this week talking about the progress with Operation Vulindlela. And it gave me a little surge of patriotism when I read it. It was fantastic. So I'm very keen just to hear how that's been working and your role in that.
Yeah. So I want to start my response by going back to this issue of partnership and collaboration. And, there's a statement that I made at, I think it was last year's ministerial symposium, when I was asked to do a closing. And the statement I made was, the supply, going forward, the supply of minerals and particularly critical minerals and being able to bridge this supply chain risk is going to be more about, I think, cultural integration rather than actually the commerce behind it. And I think it's something that I'm seeing unfolding already. If you look at the geopolitics between China and America, the geopolitics as they're manifesting in terms of, minerals for peace and the leveraging of economic and competitive advantage in order to gain access. And it's something that I'm seeing a lot more in terms of how, systemic change happens. And I think when it comes to Operation Vulindlela, we're getting over that cultural divide between business and government and trying to bridge this trust. And it took some time. And one of the things for which the Minerals Council particularly was responsible for, it went out on a limb in terms of, the criticism towards the leadership of Transnet, 2 years ago, where we said without a change in leadership and without getting the right leadership in place, we're not going to be able to make progress. And no sooner had new leadership come into place, we saw progress, because there was a culture change, and that's something I think is not often appreciated in terms of what it's going to require, even on the topic of regional integration and regional cooperation. We're not one continent. I think we're also seeing how in other territories that might be one country, but they're federal systems. So that's one thing, and therefore where I'm going with this is that the whole concept of leadership intent and leadership integrity is absolutely critical to being able to achieve and over what we have achieved so far in terms of Operation Vulindlela and overcome the challenges. And there's still many to come. And so the Minerals Council has been quite involved with Operation Vulindlela across the three key crisis areas. We have CEOs of our companies involved, deployed, and have been engaging on a regular basis and are always there when they're called upon. When they're not just for mere meetings, but when it comes to the NLCC, which is on the logistics side, where I'm closer to, it is not only at that level that Minerals Council members are involved, but I also like to say between the tracks, in terms of working with Transnet and TFR. In each of the corridors, the coal corridor, which is a major corridor, the iron ore, the manganese, and the chrome. And I think combined, these four corridors are probably upwards of 60 to 70% of Transnet's revenue, TFR's revenue. And so there was a lot of value at risk here that we needed to make sure we protect and to promote. And with the recent Operation Vulindlela 2.0, where I think the successes now will want to extend them to water and to municipal capacity building. And I must say that these are areas that the mining industry is not unfamiliar with, to use a double negative. In other words, we have already been involved in securing water supply in various areas where the mining industry is involved, at both a company level, where you find one company being the dominant economy in that municipality or that district, or as a collective, such as what you would find in Limpopo, in the Libalelo district, or in the Northern Cape, where you've got a cluster of manganese and iron ore and other players, where the infrastructure is aged and it's not providing for a consistent and reliable supply of water. And the presence of the mining industry is actually enabling for capital to be raised in order to invest in that water infrastructure. And what has been interesting is that where you get certainty of supply of water, you then get a water-based economy. So the mining industry becomes a catalyst of opportunities, both seen and unforeseen, and unseen rather, for economic development and other development. And that's one thing that really excites me about mining, just the catalytic nature and the multiply effect that it has both socially and economically.
Mzila, we've covered some pretty big macro issues, critical minerals, infrastructure, sort of trade corridors, regional integration, industrialization. I mean, these are all big topics. They really are the headliners in the news and in mining in general. But almost to the point, and this is just my opinion, and you can contradict me, but the topic of exploration is becoming almost secondary because there's bigger things to discuss at the moment. And I don't want us to forget just how important exploration is. we've seen South Africa attempt in a lot of different ways to improve the situation around exploration. The DNPR and the IDC have launched an exploration fund, and Minister Gwedi Mantashe, has announced a new cadastral system. Let's go back to the roots of the importance of mining around exploration. Where do you think we are as a country in terms of exploration performance, and as a country in South Africa? But perhaps you want to refer to the continent at large. And let's not forget that exploration is the starting point around which all other conversations we're having today is actually centered.
Absolutely. I think one thing I can assure you that I suppose whilst I'm in this role, exploration is certainly not going to be in the back burner. It's going to be, it will be quietly and very determinedly moving forward, because, it is an area that I'm giving a lot of attention to with the team. It's an area where we're having very good conversations with government, with somebody like Musa from CGS. And you're absolutely right. That's where mining begins. So where we're sitting at the moment as South Africa is that we're just on 1% of global exploration. The African continent is about 10%, and these are levels compared to the past, where 10, 15 years ago we're at 5% as South Africa, and I think with the continent it was probably 15 to 20%. And that's a function of a number of things. I think firstly, exploration is also driven by where the money is. So let's not forget. And the one area where consistently investors have seen money is in gold. And so gold continues to attract exploration, particularly in the rest of the continent, where the geology is very different to the geology of gold in South Africa, which was this massive Witwatersrand ore body, which we've been mining for the past 120 years. We reached our peak of 1,000 tons in 1970. And it has been, gradually coming down, and we're sitting now, I think, at just a touch below 100 tons of gold that we are producing. We've exhausted it, technically up to a point. So the deepest mine right now is close to 4 kilometers. Is there more gold? Well, with the manner in which it exists at those depths, it continues further down. But technologically, to be able to mine that safely and providing for the health and well-being of employees is not yet possible. See my hopefulness, not yet possible. But we've seen one or two possible new gold mines coming up, and in some instances, reopening of other gold mines. So that's one reason why we've seen a decline in exploration, particularly in gold. But I think the other thing is that the majors have a huge influence in terms of directing expenditure towards exploration. And with changes in politics, in terms of different geographies, pressures from shareholders, they also look at different ways of growing. And M&A has certainly taken up the top of the agenda in terms of future growth. But we've seen, there's been a huge growth in juniors, and we can talk of Canada and Australia, but they also rely on the majors to be able to raise some of that capital, and they will be directed towards particular commodities. So a commodity like copper is another one that has consistently received investment. And then recently we've seen a lot of money flow into nickel and lithium. But, things turn, and this is a very cyclical industry. But what becomes important, and to be able to maintain consistency of investment into exploration, is policy. Because that is, as you said, the foundation. And this is an area where you'll recall when the MRD bill was released, we indicated that we had been in conversation with the DMPR, and we indicated that it's got to remove burdens, all burdens on exploration, because, and it was with particular reference to the need for empowerment, and particularly empowerment where the very exploration company has to provide the funding for the BE partner. So you're providing funding on funding you don't have, so to speak. And then you have to provide investment into a whole lot of social investments with money you don't have or with borrowed money. So, and it's an approach that we've seen being taken with all entrepreneurial ventures, and mining and exploration deserves the same. And so the DMPR very quickly then retracted what it had initially announced as the continued need for empowerment. So we're eagerly awaiting the revised version of the MRD bill in its fullest write-up to be able to see that, exploration has been given a new lease of life. And I think that will certainly play a huge role in terms of leaving just the market risk to the investors to deal with. And then secondly is the other element that you spoke about, which is the cadastral, because it all starts with, well, if I have an interest in exploring in South Africa, what's available and what can I find out before I lay foot or rand in the country? And so the cadastral system is that system which will provide the necessary information to be able to spark interest in exploration in South Africa. So it has to be a system that is efficient in terms of access to all information that will be required, and it has to provide for transparency in terms of what is readily available, what is not available, and it has to have integrity that, when you apply, your application will be considered within the specified time and that you will get a response within the specified time. Those are the small things that I think will begin to shift sentiment towards investing in South Africa, but specifically in mining, and also begin to increase the confidence in South Africa being a destination for investment.
Mzila, thank you. I feel like those new investors that might be targeting exploration assets in South Africa could listen to this podcast and then have a snapshot of exactly where the industry is. We've covered a lot of ground, and you've been incredibly generous with your insights and your perspective on the industry, which I think is pretty unique in terms of the diversity of your experience, what you've been working on the last few years, and the quantum of the challenges our industry has had to face. I think the way I'd like to end this conversation is maybe get a sense of, given everything that we've managed to generate in terms of momentum, given that realignment in trade we spoke about, given this need for South Africa to really stand up and start leveraging its advantages in a very different way in this new world, where do you see the industry in 10 years' time, or 5 years' time, if that's an easier question? And what will the work of the council be to realize that vision that you might have?
Yeah, I think I love that question, because how I've been reflecting on it has been really to just take a step back, and particularly at this point in time where we've been working, we're going to begin some work on an investment and growth strategy for the South African mining industry. And that in itself, I think for me, is just a demonstration of our confidence in the mining industry. And where that confidence comes from for me is, firstly, when I reflect on the past 100 years and what the South African mining industry has done in terms of shaping society in South Africa to where it is today, shaping the economy, and what we've been able to achieve in terms of degrees of industrialization, infrastructure development. If you think of entities, state-owned entities that were born out of the need for industrialization, which was supported by revenues from gold, at a time of sanctions in the country. And so where we are today, I think we have an opportunity for a mining industry that can socially and economically have the same degree, if not more, of influence in terms of the future of the country, but in a way that is much more inclusive than what we've seen in the past. And that inclusivity will manifest in the whole population of South Africa and the capability that it has to offer being harnessed. The skills, the mining industry in the past was born out of low skills with vast numbers. and the social system was designed to support that. We now have an opportunity where the mining industry is going to grow and see a future on the back of a high level of skills, which need to come from South Africa. And that high level of skills with the technology and innovation means that it is not about muscle, but it's about brain. And therefore, you're able to also harness the brain power of women. And we're seeing that happening already. So the inclusivity will be quite diverse. And, the kind of transformation I believe we need to be talking about is that fundamental in terms of how the mining industry takes the whole of society forward, enables the energy transition, but it will be triggering so many other transitions. And this change needs to be transmitted, I think, not only in urban areas, but also in rural areas, taking advantage of nuances. It's not about replicating Johannesburg everywhere else, but I think it's about how, through the mining industry, through the skills that are developed and the capabilities, where people are at, they're able to build their livelihoods and establish well-being, either on a rural economy or an ocean economy or a mining economy, but all of which I think will have been catalyzed by mining. That is where I see the mining industry, and that will be over the next 5 years, over the next 10 years, over the next 25 to 30 years and beyond.
Mzila, I just want to thank you for some of the things we've discussed today, and it's actually made me reflect on my own career in the mining industry, which is not too bad either, considering I started in the early 2000s, and just realizing how much change has happened in the industry, even in the time frame that I've joined. And I actually look at it as a positive. I'd say we're progressing well, and things are moving forward in a positive light, despite the numerous challenges that we have. But we're in a different world today than we were 20 years ago, and I feel positive about the direction of travel that we're going, the inclusivity that you've spoken about, the technological evolution, the way we need to partner to build a greater industry within Africa, and just how important the mining industry is to all of those elements combined together. So I've enjoyed your reflections, Mzila, that have made me think a lot about the past 20 years in the mining industry, and I feel positive about the future. So from my side, just thank you so much for those reflections today.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning into a Voices of Africa podcast this week. Voices of Africa is a forum where Africa's leading experts weigh in on cross-sectional topics affecting the continent. Experts share their views on how we can unlock greater value that will benefit industry, government, and communities. For more of our insights, visit our website or subscribe to our weekly newsletter, Views on Africa, in the description.